white Christian nationalism is wrong on a lot of levels, but if you want to talk about a very basic level, it's a violation of the third commandment. Thou shalt not take the Lord's name in vain, which of course doesn't refer to cussing or using bad words. It's fundamentally about not doing things in God's name that God would never condone. So all out war, blatant disregard for the rule of law, trampling over human rights and civil rights, and then calling it Christian. That is a violation of the third commandment. That is taking the Lord's name in vain. And so we can talk about the dangers of white Christian nationalism politically and civically. We can talk about it socially and historically. We can also talk about it theologically and religiously.
That was Jemar Tisby, historian and author of best-selling books such as The Color of Compromise and his newest book, The Spirit of Justice. In this interview, I asked Jemar several questions about current events and some other topics which are relevant to my book coming out next year. I plan to save those answers for later near the end of the podcast when I talk more about my new book. Today, I want to share what Jemar had to say about our current situation. My view is that the Christian nationalist beliefs and ideology both drive and are strengthened by many of the policies of the Trump administration. Although the Trump administration isn't very helpful to Christians around the world, American Christian nationalists are cheering on this administration. These topics I discussed today in my interview with Jemar Tisby. Welcome to the podcast series Telling Jefferson Lies. I'm Warren Throckmorton. This season, I'm focusing on two main aspects of the false belief that America was founded as a Christian nation. First, I'm exposing the false history which props up Christian nation storytelling. Second, I'm listening to experts discuss the weaknesses of Christian nationalism. This interview is part of that second purpose. I began by asking Jemar about the recent cuts in foreign aid, which have brought misery to many foreign nations, including many Christians.
The logic of the empire is to enrich the few at the expense of the many. So I think one of the refrains right now, both for Christians and for voters in general, is they're stealing from you. Or the refrain that we've heard at various protests, tax the rich. Because what's happening is they're doing all of this not for sort of power in this amorphous, undefined kind of way. It is power in the sense of they want to be able to do what they want to do. Hence, the scrubbing of what the White House, being the richest person in the world. So that's happening on one level. The other thing, if you saw Trump's deplorable AI-generated video of Gaza, where he's essentially displacing all of the Palestinians, all of the Gazans, and creating what he calls a Mediterranean Riviera. That's about money. That's about buckets and truckloads full of money. And that's what empire has always been about. And it will absolutely bulldoze human rights on the way to making money. And the Bible has a lot to say about greed and avarice and mammon. And we ought to revisit that.
I don't know how to characterize the group of Christians that gather around him to pray. I don't know if you saw the Yahoo article, or I don't know if it was on their site. Court evangelicals, like John Fia calls them, gathered around with nary a confrontation about any of this.
The empire always needs its clerics, and that's what these folks are. What I assume is happening is they see the bounty and the benefits of co-signing this, whether it's exposure, money, specific appointments, and power. But when Satan took Jesus up to the mountain and top of the temple and said, "I'll give you all of this if you will just bow to me," Jesus said no, but others of us said yes. And that's what it looks like when you see all these folks surrounding the president with not a mumbling word to say in opposition to blatant human rights abuses, grift and theft, and just abysmal leadership. And it's really embarrassing. And it does harm to the witness of the church.
Oh, yeah.
Because if people see that and they think, well, that's what Christians are about, well, who would want anything to do with Christianity?
I know that these are government programs, the USAID, but, many of those recipients were religious organizations. I know they're not all Christian. Some are, other denominations. They can't and shouldn't distinguish between religious organizations, the NGOs in those countries. But many Christians are dying there in those countries because they're not getting those benefits. And then Ukrainian Christians.
Yes.
I mean, they're Ukrainians of all faiths. But if you're trying to appeal even to the tribal loyalties of people, you can bring up the idea that evangelicals are getting persecuted by Putin and that war, and it just doesn't seem to make a difference. I can't get over that.
I can't either. And I was just on a Southern civil rights tour / pilgrimage, which was powerful in and of itself. We went to places like the Whitney Plantation in New Orleans. We went to the Medgar and Murray Evers home in Jackson. We walked the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma. We went to the Lynching Memorial and Museum in Montgomery. And also, for me, what was crucial, we went to the parsonage where MLK and Coretta Scott King lived when he was pastor at Dexter Avenue Baptist. Anyway, it wasn't just significant for where we went. It was significant for who we went with. And it was a group of Palestinian Christians who joined us. And it was so powerful because their most frequent refrain, request, plea was, why aren't more Christians in the U.S. speaking up for us? Why aren't more of our brothers and sisters in Christ pleading our cause and our case? And they're only 1% to 2% of the population in that area. So it's a very small group, often gets looked over and left out. But to your point, if you're making a religious appeal, then at the very least, right? It's a broader humanitarian issue. It's genocide happening. But at the very least, you could say, well, this is affecting our spiritual family, and we ought to do something to mitigate and stop the killing that's happening. But not even that can penetrate through the ideology of empire, because we've been, in the US especially, so brainwashed with this premillennial theology, this wrapping up of the modern nation state of Israel with the biblical Israel of the whole Old Testament. And it's such a warped understanding that we can't, too many people, I won't say we can't, too many people don't care to or don't want to differentiate between the two, and people are dying because of it.
Yeah. People ask, well, what are really the big deal about Christian nationalism? Well, when you really unpack it, it affects an awful lot. And, in this, right now, I mean, in this administration, Trump doesn't have to be out there preaching it. It's the policies that the people he has brought into the administration are implementing. And of course, he's fine with.
Absolutely right.
Yeah.
And to me, to put it in Christian terms, white Christian nationalism is wrong on a lot of levels. But if you want to talk about a very basic level, it's a violation of the third commandment. Thou shalt not take the Lord's name in vain. which of course doesn't refer to cussing or using bad words.
Mm-hmm.
It's fundamentally about not doing things in God's name that God would never condone. So all out war, blatant disregard for the rule of law, trampling over human rights and civil rights, and then calling it Christian. That is a violation of the third commandment. That is taking the Lord's name in vain. And so we can talk about the dangers of white Christian nationalism politically and civically. We can talk about it socially and historically. We can also talk about it theologically and religiously. If you care at all about your Bible, which all these folks claim to, then you ought to be incensed, actually, at one specific example, the so-called Trump Bible.
Yeah.
Or the God Bless the USA Bible, which has the Constitution, the Declaration of Independence, the Bill of Rights, and just as a bonus, the lyrics to that Lee Greenwood song, God Bless the USA. What on earth are any of those documents doing in with the Bible? And we know it's this blending of empire and religion and calling itself Christianity. We should be able to see through that, and those Bibles should never exist.
Now let's come back to DEI. The question I had written down way back when I first contacted you was, is there a historical context for this assault on DEI? I'll start with that and then, follow up.
History's always a great place to start.
Yeah.
There are a couple places. Number one, there's the pattern of backlash to Black racial progress, right? We can look at this in all sorts of ways, going back to the Haitian Revolution, for one example, where it became the first independent former slave communities, slave nation that successfully staged a revolution, and they have faced economic sanctions and reprisals ever since. That has completely impoverished the country for now 200 years. You can also look at Civil War, of course, Reconstruction, and then the Redemption era, which, by the way, I keep trying to say more often, those periods overlapped, right? It wasn't like there was no backlash from the Civil War to 1877. The KKK is being formed in 1865, right? So there's always this stuff, but that election where Hayes is installed is just kind of a punctuation mark because they withdraw federal troops after that. But then, that again, nature abhors a vacuum. So what filled that space of enforcement was the enforcement of white supremacy through the Jim Crow era and specifically through lynching laws and the disenfranchisement or lynching practices and the disenfranchisement of Black voters. Then you get up to the mid 20th century, there's a more direct link to the anti-diversity, equity, and inclusion, starting with Brown v. Board. And so you get the white racist reactionaries called the day of the ruling Black Monday. And then, of course, you get Southern politicians writing the Southern Manifesto. And then, of course, you get this doctrine of massive resistance, which wasn't a grassroots thing. This was politicians at the federal and state level saying, we are going to resist government enforced integration or desegregation in any way we know how, including forming the Citizens Council and sanctioning the Ku Klux Klan throughout the Civil Rights era. Then you get to a more direct legal link of diversity, equity, and inclusion in the present day, 1964 Civil Rights Act, which explicitly is saying, look, you cannot discriminate based on race or sex or religion, right? And now you're getting the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. You're getting the enforcement of the Civil Rights Act. And that is read by white supremacists, racists, less educated white people, poorer white people. That's read as anti-white discrimination. That's read as reverse racism, going all the way back to the 60s, right? And then you get other social movements, the women's movement, the LGBTQ movement, the Chicano movement in the 1970s, Black Power. And then you get folks like Reagan, who make it just really goes back to Nixon as well. But you get folks like Reagan who are popularizing the war on crime. You get George H.W. Bush and Willie Horton. You get the trope of the welfare queen. Democrats are participating in this as well. In the 80s and 90s, you're using different terms. You're using terms like multiculturalism. Affirmative action is always in the mix as a term. But then you get to the 2010s and the 2020s, and you're starting to use the term diversity, equity, and inclusion. Sometimes they add the letter A, accessibility, DEIA. So there's a continuity there. It goes by different labels, but it's all part of saying to historically marginalized and excluded groups, we're going to make pathways for you that were not there because of injustice and unfair discrimination. And you have people on the right saying, well, that's reverse racism. You are, quote, taking jobs and opportunities and placements at colleges and universities from deserving white people and giving them to undeserving minorities, which there's at least two fallacies there. One is that white people should have the first crack at any opportunity because they're white. And then two, that if a person of color, a disabled person, DEI even includes military veterans, if they're part of it, they're automatically lesser qualified than a white person would be. So it's just toe up from the floor up is all kinds of messed up, and there is a history to it.
Now, I saw a chart that showed that DEI, just as a policy or a program, was more common after the summer of George Floyd. Does that ring true for you?
Absolutely. You had this flowering of interest in racial justice for about 2 seconds.
Yep. Okay. And then, of course, since Trump's been elected, the chart showed that, that's come down, although not back to where it was. That some companies are kind of hanging on. They're being quiet about it, but they're hanging on some. And so, do you think that the companies or what's your feeling about this? The companies that added DEI initiatives, were they doing that just for economic purposes, just because people seem to call for it, want it? Are companies that blown by the wind? Do you see this coming back? I mean, what's your thoughts about where this is going?
I do think companies are that blown by the wind. And when we're talking about companies, ultimately we're talking about people in charge. So we're talking about executive level folks. We're talking about boards of trustees. We're talking about some shareholders, right? And certainly the George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, that summer of 2020, there was enormous social and cultural pressure to do something. And how short our memories are. This is just 5 years ago. But we should remember, like, this was a truly remarkable moment in U.S. history regarding race. I mean, it really did feel like for months that the tide was shifting, that maybe finally, not we're going to solve every racial problem, but that we were going to take a decisive turn in the direction of progress. And corporations felt that. I do believe there were some folks who thought it was just the right thing to do. I do think there were folks who thought that and saw an economic opportunity, perhaps. But also what's happening now is, number one, I think there were plenty of people in leadership at those corporations who are far right folks, and it tends to go with enormous wealth. They are pro tax breaks for the rich. They want to be part of the in crowd now politically and economically. And so they were never like super excited about this stuff, but they went along with it because that seemed to be the way the wind was blowing. I think there are plenty of folks like that. But also now these companies are under pressure, that the Trump regime is threatening deep economic reprisals and recrimination to the tune of hundreds of millions of dollars for companies and even universities. I mean, we can look at Columbia University. I think they lost $400 million in federal funding. So like that's not inconsequential. And for a business that has to stay in business by making money, that kind of pressure is going to result in them backtracking. Now, the morality of it, we can talk about, but they're not doing it out of nowhere or just on their own. They're being pressured by this regime to conform and or go out of business in a lot of cases.
Yeah. Yeah. What are you telling people now? Like, I mean, this is just an absolutely bizarre time.
Yep.
It's like whiplash. We've gone, like you said, 5 years ago, and we've gone in that space of time to Nazi world. It's so crazy. And in my lifetime, I mean, I've seen some pretty low points. The 60s were pretty rough, but gosh, the pace of change has accelerated.
It really has, and in a bad direction. It is remarkable how quickly we can go backwards and down. I don't even know if backwards is right, because it seems like we're sinking lower than some of our lowest points. And by that, I mean the very levers of democracy that we use to ensure the peaceful transfer of power and changes in administration, that's all being taken away. Mm-hmm. I don't know how we can recover any sense of democratic stability, because even if Democrats win an election, that doesn't mean that people on the far right will just accept it.
Yeah.
And I think a line has been crossed that folks aren't going to backtrack to peace. I think political violence is going to be, unfortunately, something that we should expect from now on. In addition, what I keep telling people, particularly the church, is this is not business as usual. Do not count on a midterm election or another presidential election to change the game. If you think that is the solution, you're going to be sorely mistaken and very unpleasantly surprised. The other thing that's deeply concerning to me is the disappearing of people. So we can think of, as we record this, Mahmoud Khalil is in custody. Absolutely no trial, no credible evidence of any wrongdoing. He has been arrested and detained because of exercising his First Amendment free speech rights and protesting in support of Palestinians. Yeah. And they're calling that anti-Semitic. And they're calling him a pro-Hamas activist. And Hamas being labeled a terrorist organization, they're saying, well, we can revoke his green card, we can incarcerate him. But no evidence, no trial, nothing. And there were some days in which he was first incarcerated in New Jersey, then he was moved down to Louisiana, and people didn't know. And the human impact is his wife is 8 months pregnant, and he will likely still be incarcerated at the birth of their first child. Now, that's also happening at the same time that the Trump regime deports 238 Venezuelans to El Salvador. Now, again, no due process, suspicion or allegation that they're members of a gang, and that is the premise under which they were deported. And they didn't just go anywhere. They went to El Salvador, which has a supermax prison that can hold up to 40,000 people. That is part of the current president's promise to bring back law and order, right? And really, what human rights groups are saying is that the entire carceral system in El Salvador are essentially torture camps. It's systemized brutality. So Trump sent these men, more than 200 of them, to some of the most brutal prisons that we know of. And so even now, they're probably being deprived of civil and human rights, of medical care, being violently abused. We don't even know, because it's now in a different country. And I'll add one more thing to that. This was in defiance of a court order to turn the plane around. Yeah. So this is a constitutional crisis where the executive branch is ignoring the judicial branch and saying we are above the law. And that is exactly what dictators and kings try to do. Yeah. That's what I'm telling people.
They who have ears to hear, let them hear. Collectively, Americans did not hear the warnings of January 6th, and now we are experiencing significant challenges to due process, equal justice, and other aspects of constitutional order. As I wrap up this episode, there are multiple confirmations of what Jemar had to say earlier in the year when we conducted this interview. For instance, what Jemar had to say about the pain of Palestinian Christians and the rift in the American church testifies to the fact that the Christian church has been fractured by the Christian nationalism of the Trump administration. Right now, the United States is no friend to the international church. Before I explain why I say that, let me say first that I believe the United States should open its doors to all those persecuted for their religious views, whatever they are. I don't think Christians should get favored treatment. This administration favors American Christians over other religions in the U.S., but is hostile to non-American Christians. As we discussed in the interview, one of the first acts of the Trump administration was to terminate foreign aid, which benefited so many people of all religions, including Christians. In addition, if you are fleeing religious persecution abroad, you can no longer find an ally in the United States. Likewise, if you are in this country because of religious persecution, you are likely to be deported. Christians from Iran right now are being threatened with deportation despite certain persecution. To those international brothers and sisters, the Christian in the Trump administration's Christian nationalism is about as useful as the P in psychotic. On July 17th, the Washington Post reported that people who have been in the United States legally and without incident since 1999 will be deported. It's becoming clear every day that Trump's mass deportation is racially motivated. It is hard to understand under what definition of Christianity or compassion these actions are being taken. The only way to understand them is to take them at face value. They are cruel. In fact, cruelty seems to be the point. Recently, it was disclosed that the government's closing of foreign aid programs led to the expiration of food purchased for children in Pakistan and Afghanistan. Because there is no means to get the food from where it is stored to the children, the government is just going to burn it up. There is something really wrong with this. I suppose one might have a conversation about the best way to help people across the globe, but cutting needy people off without food, water, and medical care without warning is just cruel. Here's what I want to know. Why is an administration which claims the United States is a Christian nation known more for its cruelty than for its compassion? What was Jesus known for? I again want to thank Jemar Tisby for his time and wisdom today. Please follow the podcast and share it with your friends. Stay tuned for more great interviews and information about my upcoming book, The Christian Past That Wasn't. Music today was provided by Earl's Taco Shack, Dustin Blatnick, and Jonas Fair. Thanks for all the great reviews and ratings, and as always, thanks for listening.